everyone, good morning. It's rather interesting that citizen mobilization that's happening in several parts of the world is changing the realignment and leading to political alignment domestically and also on international sphere. The countries and the negotiations are changing, and what does it really mean for India and India's approach to its neighboring countries and to the world at large. Joining me on this conversation is the Vice President of the BJP, the ruling dispensation of the country, and also the biggest political party in the world now, Panda?
About 180 million people.
So that certainly is the biggest political party.
Yes, indeed.
Yes. So let me begin with the questions, because there are anti-CA protests that are taking place in India. At the same time, demonstrations taking place in Venezuela, Hong Kong and Iran. How does state negotiate with these demonstrations? Because I think increasingly how the state is responding is very limited to the nature of the government, the way we are seeing it happen in Iran, Hong Kong or other countries, and also in India.
So I think we have to see the significant differences between these various examples around the world. On the one hand, India is the world's largest democracy. It has checks and balances. It has a media that puts out various points of view. It has the courts which intervene depending on what is happening. Now, the demonstrations that you see in, for example, in Iran or Venezuela are significantly different than this. And another way that there is a big difference is, if you take, for example, Hong Kong, here there are fundamental issues about democracy itself, and also the geography is very different. When you have a big protest in Hong Kong, the city essentially is the nation, and the whole nation then comes to a standstill. When you look at a very large country like India, it's quite different, because these anti-CAA protests are in some mega cities and in some neighborhoods. If you go to the mid-sized towns, if you go to the rural areas, it isn't there. So there are significant differences, and there are obviously significant differences as to how the state reacts to them, because the structures of the states are quite different in these countries.
And how India's engagement, I mean, I'm seeing how, particularly related to anti-CAA protests and abrogation of Article 370, how different countries that India engages with reacted to, and they are continuing to react. I would say that is this a significant change from what you had seen in the past because of the nature of democracy that we are today?
Actually, it's a very positive development in what's happening. After the abrogation of Article 370, I was on a lecture tour in the UK and the US. So, there is a lot of narrative out there that is completely devoid of facts. A lot of people didn't realize that Article 370 was the only article in the Indian Constitution which said temporary. A lot of them didn't realize internationally that it has no bearing on any of India's arrangements or agreements with the rest of the world. This was only an internal domestic matter. So the thing is, we should go out and tell our story, and we have often not done that. But if you saw in India, there was a very muted response to Article 370.
Yes.
Quite different to what is happening in on the CAA issue.
That's right.
And if you compare that to what is happening in Venezuela, it's been going on for years. What's happening in Iran, you see it periodically happen for different reasons, this time because of an airliner being downed. And in Hong Kong, it's been going on for a fairly long time.
Yes.
So I think there are significant differences.
And then I've been reading a lot of articles, and there are multiple views on this. Should India be taking a position at all on Iran or not? One view and one school of thought is that there should be ambiguity around it, and that works in India's interest.
I think India has had a long-standing principle that we don't like to meddle in the domestic affairs of other nations, and we have taken a moral stand about others not interfering in our domestic stand. Apart from that, there's a general principle that people must have the ability to express themselves, which, as long as it is done peacefully, as long as there are no reprisals, I don't think there is any conflict between the two views.
But then we have seen what happened when the Prime Minister traveled to United States. It wasn't really not meddling with in domestic affairs.
No. I think that's quite a wrong way to see things. If you mean the Howdy Modi program, for instance, now we have the world's largest diaspora, and the Indian diaspora everywhere in the world is is liked, it is popular, it is contributing to their economy, and in the US large numbers of the Indian diaspora are involved in US politics as staffers, as candidates, and so on and so forth. So Prime Minister Modi has been having these kind of events for several years, and in fact if you look at the history of the concept of soft power, this is a leveraging of India's soft power. It's got nothing to do with domestic politics of any other country.
But how much of this soft power gets strengthened when you have a majority government, the kind that Prime Minister Modi has?
Look, I think India's soft power comes from a variety of things. It comes from our millennia long culture and history. It comes from things like yoga, it comes from Bollywood, it comes from our scientific community. When we put spacecraft on missions to Mars and the moon, it creates soft power for India. And of course, the huge popularity that Prime Minister Modi enjoys adds to it. You know, take International Yoga Day for instance.
Yes.
Now, yoga is something that's been around for a long time, but it took an individual to push it up to the UN level to assign a day for it.
But Panda, talking specifically about the domestic equations changing internationally, but vis-a-vis what's happening in the Middle East, and India under Prime Minister Narendra Modi has invested a lot in oil diplomacy, as it is often termed as. Does that really impact after what has happened in Iran and Iran's equation with the United States?
I think, to be fair, the Prime Minister has invested immensely in diplomacy per se, because I mean, look at the kind of effort he puts in personally, the kind of rigorous schedule he maintains in traveling all over the world, not just to the Middle East. He's been all over the world, and to raise the recognition of brand India, to raise our influence, to build relationships. So I think you've seen the positive benefits of his focus on the Middle East in terms of cracking down on criminals who have been evading Indian justice, in terms of of how our diaspora in the Middle East is perceived. So I think that I don't think there's any downside to this. And as far as what happens to petroleum markets,
yes,
as far as what happens to geopolitical developments that can cause hiccups, I think it's good that we have strengthened our position and our relationships across the world.
And then finances, in terms of India's approach to economy, which has been very different from what it was. Even the manner in which you have been pushing the envelope of the manner in which India will be engaging with various countries. On the trade front, how will that impact your domestic equations? I was reading something in the papers today, particularly what was said by the Malaysians, that they will be making a comment on the Citizenship Amendment Act, and that they cannot turn a blind eye because of a significant minority population in India which is raising a voice against it.
Look, the Malaysians are free to raise their voice, and we are free to make our economic choices of whom we prioritize for trade relations. This is the nature of geopolitics around the world. But the reality is, India is such a large country, and in terms of the economy also, India is well on its way to becoming the third largest economy in the world in a decade's time. Everybody around the world recognizes that. So we have to leverage that also for our own advantage. And as far as trade is concerned, the whole world is seeing a disruption, if you will, because we've been seeing for many decades the globalization of the world economy. And what we've seen in the last 2 years.
But you're not an observer in this disruption, you're rather a participant.
Indeed.
And in fact, you are also creating disruption.
No, in fact, when you look at the Indian domestic economy, for instance, we may have a different view about it. In the Indian media, there's been a lot of talk about the lower rate of growth. But if you look at the Indian economy from a global perspective, it is one of the brightest shining spots in terms of having growth. So we must not forget that perspective.
Last question to you. Is it all right for your neighboring countries and countries with whom you have really invested in the last 5.5 years of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to make comments on what is being seen as domestic affairs of India, of course on not as much on Section 3, Article 370 and abrogation, but on Citizenship Amendment Act?
Look, I think the way the Citizenship Amendment Act has been spun by certain sections in India does a gross injustice to those sections of people, the minorities in some of these neighboring countries, who have indeed faced persecution. Now, we have had an obligation to give them shelter. Right from Mahatma Gandhi's times, these assurances have been given in public. Now, other countries have done so, the US has done so, European countries have done so for minorities who have faced persecution in certain countries. So, this is it's not something unusual or something wrong, it's a global norm to give priority to those fleeing persecution. That does not mean
but
that
the intent of your government is questioned again and again, Mr. Panda.
The point is, it does not affect our relationship with any of the neighboring countries. It is not an either or. Just because we have a humanitarian gesture of giving shelter to minorities who are escaping persecution does not mean that we will not engage with the governments of those countries or have better relationships.
Whether those governments will be engaging with you, that is also a question, given the kind of response that has come from Bangladeshis in particular.
Look, there may be temporary misunderstandings about some issues, but those are going to be resolved. Look at the trajectory of what has been happening with Bangladesh. It is all for the better. All
right, Jai Panda, always a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much for watching this chat with in this Raisina Dialogue. But the larger question, of course, is, does the politics impact geopolitics? It certainly does. But given the changes that is happening internationally and globally, should these countries be reacting to what is seen as domestic issues? That is something that the world leaders will have to take a call. Thanks so much for watching.